Have you ever felt that gnawing frustration, maybe with your own kid or, a student you really cared about? They're clearly struggling, falling behind in school, and you just know, deep down, something's not quite right.
Mm-hmm.
You see their potential, but when you ask for help, you get that phrase, let's just wait and see.
Ugh. Yeah, that's a tough one.
That feeling, watching a child just drift further, needing support, but being told, essentially, sorry, you haven't failed enough yet. It's just agonizing, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, today we're doing more than just a deep dive. We're really pulling back the curtain on that exact scenario. We're getting into the complex, sometimes, frankly, heartbreaking world of identifying specific learning disabilities, SLDs.
Right.
Our mission today, to unpack how these diagnostic methods have evolved, will trace that path from approaches that, believe it or not, actually required kids to fail significantly.
The wait to fail model.
Exactly. All the way to what everyone hoped would be more proactive methods like response to intervention or RTI. But here's the twist, the thing we'll really uncover. Even with good intentions, these hidden cracks, they're still there.
They absolutely are.
And certain unique learners, we'll talk about gestalt language processors. They keep falling through, misunderstood, underserved, and that's happening right now based on, the latest analyses from just this past August, 2025.
Yeah, it's more than just looking back at history, isn't it? It's about understanding the real profound impact these systemic issues have on actual lives. When we talk about defining and identifying learning disabilities, we're talking about a child's access to school, their feeling of self-worth, their whole future, really.
Yeah.
And like you said, that August 2025 update, it's not just a date. It's a kind of a stark reminder that these arguments, these consequences, they're still playing out every single day.
Okay, so let's dig into the foundation of this whole problem then. Because for years, the main way we identified a learning disability was using something called the IQ achievement discrepancy criterion.
Right?
It sounds, logical on paper, this idea of a discrepancy, but what did that actually look like in practice for a student sitting in a classroom?
You're right. On the surface, it did seem to make sense. So under this model, to get special ed support, a student basically had to show a severe discrepancy,
Yeah.
a big gap between their measured intellectual ability, their IQ score, and how they were actually doing in school, in reading or math.
Uh-huh.
The thinking was, okay, if a child's clearly smart, but they're really underachieving, there must be some kind of underlying learning disability causing it.
And it sounds, objective, almost scientific. But as our sources really hammer home this method, it grew some really intense, even scathing criticism. What were the core problems? Especially this wait to fail idea.
Oh, the wait to fail part.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was maybe its most infamous cruelty. Kids often couldn't even qualify for help until that gap, that discrepancy between IQ and schoolwork, was big enough statistically.
So like a measurable failure.
Exactly, which often meant waiting until third grade, fourth grade, sometimes even later.
Wow.
And think about it, by then they're classmates. They'd already nailed down the basics of reading, writing, math.
Right, they moved on.
So imagine the frustration. You know you're bright, but you're struggling, maybe sinking, and the system basically says, sorry kid, you haven't failed quite enough yet. Come back later.
That just sounds incredibly backwards.
Yeah.
So by the time they finally qualified, that help they desperately needed was coming.
Yeah.
Well, way too late to be truly effective.
Precisely. The interventions were delayed until the gaps were just huge, making them so much harder to close. And beyond that, the model often just blurred really important lines. It struggled to reliably tell the difference between, say, underachievement, because maybe the teaching wasn't great, versus difficulties that came from a genuine, internal difference in how that child processed language.
Oh. Yep.
As one of our sources put it, quite powerfully, some students were wrongly pathologized for what is essentially poor teaching.
Oof. So they got labeled with a disability when maybe the instruction was the real problem.
That's the risk, yeah. A huge
All right.
potential for misdiagnosis. And then you mentioned the science, or maybe the lack of it.
Yeah, what about that?
Absolutely. By the late 1990s, it was pretty widely agreed in the scientific community that there was, no scientific foundation for using IQ achievement discrepancy. Not as a defining feature of LD, not as a reliable marker, nothing.
So it wasn't science.
It was, as they put it, not science, but ritual, just something people did. The idea that a discrepancy proved a learning disability, that was just an assumption, not a proven fact.
Right.
And the research actually showed that kids with these discrepancies and kids without them often responded to teaching in, pretty much the same ways. which kind of blows the whole model out of the water, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
So it didn't predict who needed help, it wasn't scientifically sound, and it forced kids to struggle needlessly.
Huh.
Were there other sort of systemic downsides?
Oh, definitely. This model, it tended to under-identify kids with lower IQ scores, even if they were also seriously underachieving.
Really?
Yeah, and it kind of disproportionately benefited kids at the higher end of the IQ scale who just happened to be struggling academically. Plus, it didn't really deal with the cultural and linguistic biases that can be baked into IQ tests themselves.
Which could unfairly affect kids from diverse backgrounds.
Exactly. So yeah, the cruelty of this delay, as the sources call it, had this devastating emotional impact. It chipped away at self-esteem, killed motivation, and just caused cumulative academic damage.
That's a pretty heavy indictment of the old way. Which brings us to, okay, what happens next? How did IDEA 2004 try to redefine what a learning disability actually is? What's the definition say, and what's really striking about what it excludes?
Well, IDEA 2004, it really tried to bring some clarity. It defines a specific learning disability, SLD, as a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language.
Okay, basic psychological processes.
That sounds broad.
It is quite broad. It covers things like dyslexia, brain injury, developmental aphasia, and it shows up as difficulties with listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or math. It tries to get at the sort of underlying mechanics of how the brain processes information.
That does sound more comprehensive, focusing on those internal processes. But our sources point out that even this definition had a kind of critical flaw, especially in its exclusions, what wasn't covered. Right, the exclusions are really important here. The definition says, crucially, that a learning difficulty cannot be primarily because of sensory issues, like blindness or deafness, or what was then called mental retardation. We know that term is outdated and harmful now. Or emotional disturbance, or, and this is key, disadvantage that is environmental, cultural, or economic.
Okay, and the idea there, I guess, was to avoid mislabeling kids whose struggles were maybe due to outside factors, not an inherent disability.
That was the intent, yeah. You want to distinguish between a true learning disability and, say, a child who's struggling because they're just learning English or they come from a really tough home environment or poverty.
Makes sense on the surface.
It does seem reasonable, but like our sources argue, the line between intrinsic and environmental is rarely so clear. It's often tangled. So this definition, even though it meant well, it kind of embeds a particular way of seeing disability as something located only inside the head in those basic psychological processes, not in the interaction between the learner and their world.
Right, it separates the two.
Yeah, it keeps this sharp distinction between disability and inequality as though the two do not intertwine. And for certain students, like these gestalt language processors, GLPs.
Okay, remind us what GLPs are again.
Right, so these are kids who naturally learn language differently. Instead of building up word by word, sound by sound, which is how most teaching is geared, they acquire language in whole chunks, scripts, or intonation patterns first.
Got it. So for them,
this framework is already predisposed to miss them. Their unique way of learning language. It often gets flagged as a disorder in speech therapy, maybe they call it echolalia, but then that same pattern is never connected to literacy development when looking for an SLD. It's like the two aren't related, which is absurd. They're left invisible by the definition itself.
So we had this really painful wait-to-fail system. Then we get a new definition that tries to be more precise, but it still leaves these huge gaps, especially for kids who learn differently, like GLPs. Clearly, something else was needed, and that's where response to intervention, RTI, enters the picture. It promised a big shift, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. RTI was really heralded as a way of building better readers. It was explicitly put into IDEA 2004 as an alternative to that broken discrepancy model.
Okay.
Its whole point was to ditch wait to fail and replace it with early help, with prevention. The basic idea is actually pretty simple, but powerful.
What's the core principle?
Every child gets high-quality, research-backed teaching right in the regular classroom. If they start to struggle, they get extra help, more instruction time, targeted interventions, usually right there, without needing a formal disability label first.
That sounds like exactly what those frustrated parents and teachers we mentioned earlier were crying out for. No more waiting around.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing as the big pluses of this RTI model?
The strengths were definitely appealing. First off, much earlier identification. You can spot kids who might be at risk sooner through regular progress checks.
Right, you're watching everyone.
Yeah, and it shifts the focus away from that one-time static IQ achievement comparison to a dynamic process of measuring progress, or the lack thereof, over time.
Mhm.
So underachievement isn't just about low scores anymore. It's about seeing if a child fails to respond even when they get good, targeted instruction.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's about gathering evidence continuously, making hopefully more nuanced decisions, and really documenting this ongoing failure to progress despite having been exposed to intensive research-based interventions. The big hope was catching kids before they fell way behind.
So, on paper, RTI seems like the answer. It's logical, it's data-driven, promises early help, ongoing checks, better decisions. But the real kicker here, the surprising part, is how even this system, designed with the best intentions, could end up creating new problems, new cracks for kids to fall through, especially the very kids we're trying hardest to catch. Where does it still fall short?
You've really nailed the paradox there. RTI, for all its promise, it carries these definite risks of misclassification. Think about high-ability kids who do have a learning disability.
Okay.
Their intelligence might let them compensate really well, especially early on. They might perform in the normal range on RTI measures, even though they're struggling internally, working twice as hard.
So they fly under the radar.
Exactly. They could be excluded from early individualized instruction that they actually desperately need just because their struggles aren't showing up clearly enough in that Tier 1 or Tier 2 data.
Wow. Okay, so on one side, we might miss kids who are compensating. What about the other side? Could RTI accidentally over-identify kids, labeling them with a disability when maybe something else is going on?
Absolutely. That's the flip side of the coin. Students from, say, environmentally disadvantaged backgrounds, minority groups, and English language learners,
Yeah.
they might be underachieving for lots of reasons other than a neurological disability.
Right.
If RTI isn't implemented really carefully with culturally responsive teaching and assessments, these kids could be wrongly labeled as having a learning disability. The real issue might be lack of appropriate instruction or resources or just language differences, not an SLD. And this leads to what our sources call the blind intervention danger. They stress that early intervention only works if those delivering it are trained to recognize why a child is struggling. You need to know the root cause.
Otherwise,
RTI just risks mistaking difference for deficit. You're applying interventions without understanding the real need.
that's such a critical point, getting to the why. And this is where learners like gestalt language processors circle back into the conversation, right? How does RTI, this system meant for early help, potentially fail them?
Yeah, for GLPs, the danger is really acute. Think about it. You have a GLP child learning language in whole phrases, intonation patterns, and they get put into intensive analytic phonics drills, breaking words down into tiny sounds.
Which is the opposite of how they naturally operate.
Exactly. So they might falter, not because they're incapable, but because the intervention itself is just fundamentally mismatched to their natural language pathway. And the educators, trained mostly in that analytic sound-by-sound approach, they might just misread natural gestalt strategies as failure to respond to intervention.
So they see the child isn't progressing with this specific intervention and assume the child has a learning disability, rather than questioning the intervention itself.
Precisely. They see the lack of progress, but they don't realize the intervention itself is the barrier, not the child's ability.
So the very tools used to spot risk, like phonological awareness tests, might be biased against these kids from the start.
That's a huge part of it. While RTI uses these critical indicators like phonological awareness for early screening, these measures are overwhelmingly normed on analytic language processors.
Okay.
They just assume a developmental pathway where phonemic awareness and segmental decoding are the universal gateway to literacy. It's baked into the system.
But that's not the path for GLPs.
Not at all. So for GLPs, such measures often fail to capture true ability or potential. They become effectively invisible within these frameworks that we're supposed to catch everyone. The system just isn't built to see or understand their way of learning.
Right.
And while the SLD definition does mention processing deficits, actually trying to measure those reliably, it's produced little that is practically useful. You can't easily separate out context, culture, language, environment. They all shape performance. It's almost impossible to disentangle all the factors neatly.
So this isn't just a history lesson. These deep systemic contradictions, they're still shaping kids' lives right now. What's really striking, and honestly a bit discouraging reading those August 2025 updates, is how little some of these fundamental issues seem to have changed in day-to-day practice. What's still happening in schools, in those eligibility meetings today?
Yeah, the author of our source material is incredibly clear on this. They say the debates it reflects are not relics of the past. They are still playing out daily in schools, in the lives of children. These aren't theoretical problems, they're real.
And for GLP specifically.
Repeatedly, the author describes encountering students who are unmistakably gestalt language processors, but they're being categorized under a specific learning disability. It's called a distortion. Using a framework never designed for them, now being used to contain them. The GLP kid gets shoved into a box that fundamentally misunderstands how they learn, twisting their difference into a deficit. It's described as Kafkaesque, but for children navigating the school system.
That distortion, it must lead to just incredibly fragmented, ineffective support then, right?
Exactly. One of the most glaring contradictions highlighted is that GLPs often get years of speech therapy for language problems, things like echolalia, scripting. But then those same problems are never once connected to literacy. It's like their speech development and their reading-writing development are treated as totally separate things.
Which makes no sense.
None at all. So a child gets help for how they talk, but the way they talk, their fundamental language processing style, is completely ignored when trying to teach them to read or write. It's this absurd, damaging disconnect.
And what about the educators on the ground? Are they picking up on these nuances, adapting?
Well, the sources point to this deep-seated resistance among many educators. Resistance to changes that could actually help in the long run, like integrating language and literacy support, or being more flexible with those rigid progress monitoring scripts.
Why the resistance?
Apparently, the system has trained teachers to mistrust anything that isn't stamped evidence-based practice, which makes it incredibly hard to introduce newer understandings like supporting GLPs effectively if it hasn't gone through years of specific kinds of validation.
Even if it makes sense for the child in front of them.
Right. And the author speaks very personally here as someone with ADHD who was also a Gestalt language processor from an older generation. They talk about having had to carve my own path to literacy decades ago, totally without system support. And they express this feeling of being incredulous and furious, that even now, education elites often dismiss work that isn't part of the mainstream canon, stressing that lived knowledge carries its own legitimacy. There's this provocative quote.
Yeah.
They say, if we GLPs were to sit quietly and wait for the science of reading mob to concede that people like us need a path to literacy within the general education classroom, we'd die holding our breath.
Wow. That's powerful.
It really is. And it underscores the heartbreaking reality that even now, GLP students are still being mislabeled, needs mistranslated, futures bound inside diagnostic categories that erase more than they reveal.
Wow. This deep dive, it's really laid bare just how complex and how deeply, deeply human this whole process of identifying learning disabilities is. We've seen the good intentions, behind models like RTI, but also how absolutely vital it is to understand their limits, especially for learners who just don't fit that mainstream analytic child mold.
Absolutely. That journey from the awful wait to fail days to RTI, it was genuinely aimed at getting help to kids sooner, making things more equitable. But as we've really dug into, without that critical awareness, without specialized training, especially about the incredible diversity in how kids process language, like GLPs, we risk just accidentally perpetuating the very problems you wanted to fix.
Right.
Truly meaningful support, it has to start with actually seeing the individual child, recognizing and really valuing their unique way of developing, not just trying to squeeze them into a diagnostic box that might erase who they are.
So here's something to think about for everyone listening. If our education system structures, if they were truly designed right from the start to be inclusive of all learners, what would it actually look like for a child to never be told they have to wait to fail? What could we achieve if we began by recognizing and affirming every single child's unique way of learning instead of only looking for deficits, and then built the system around that?